I retired from the Earth Survey Liaison Office 11 years before the transit session. By then, I had logged 34 years of postings, 17 of them inside the Soran Hegemonic Transit Authority's administrative zone, watching the authority do what oligarch cartels do when they encounter something they cannot absorb. They reclassify it until it disappears from the ledger. What they did to us in the 61st year of their founding took less than an afternoon. The revocation of survey standing, that was the formal title, stripped Earth's deep-range survey license across the entire authority corridor network. Every instrument we had registered under the old framework was reclassified overnight, not active survey assets, but background interference. Unregistered signal sources, clutter. The authority's Archival Compliance Division processed the paperwork in a single session, stamped it, and entered it into the permanent record. 64 human relay nodes and 7 long-range survey platforms, built over 20 years, reclassified as noise. Our liaison mission received the revocation notice at 06:30 on a Tuesday. No hearing, no review period. The mission chief, a quiet woman named Adara Celine, who had spent 8 years building working relationships inside the authority's own logistics division, read the document twice and set it face down on her desk. She did not call an emergency session. She did not file an immediate protest. She sent one short message up the chain, and then she sat and waited, which I did not understand at the time. I was junior staff then. I thought she was shocked into stillness. She was not shocked. She was counting. The thing the authority's compliance division had not done, in its single-session revocation of our survey standing, was read the original survey license agreements. Not the revised ones we had filed under the authority's own framework. The original ones. The instruments Earth's first survey teams had registered 69 years before the revocation session, under the pre-authority Navigational Commons Charter that the authority had absorbed, amended, and largely buried when it consolidated the corridor network in its founding decade. Pre-authority instruments did not expire. That was the rule the Commons Charter had been built on, because the deep-range assets covered by those instruments took decades to reach their survey positions, and decades more to complete their transit arcs. You could not build a 60-year survey program on a license that lapsed every 5 years. The Commons Charter had made them permanent. The authority's own founding instruments had preserved that clause because 3 of the authority's 7 charter members had pre-authority survey programs of their own. One of those programs was ours. The revocation of survey standing had reclassified our assets as background interference. But the pre-authority instrument that governed the oldest of those assets, a cylindrical relay platform Earth had launched 71 years before the revocation session, long before the authority existed, long before any of the corridor network had been charted, had never been surrendered. It had never been voided. It had not been superseded by the revised framework because we had never filed a revised framework application for it. It had simply continued, registered under the Commons Charter, doing exactly what it was built to do. Adara Celine knew this, because she had read the original instrument when she was a first-year survey attaché, before my time. She had read it, and she had understood what it meant, and she had kept her mouth shut about it for 8 years of postings, and then, on that Tuesday at 06:30, she had counted. The platform was on schedule. It had been on schedule for 71 years. I was not in the public gallery the day the transit session convened. I was retired by then, living on the near side of the authority's primary corridor zone, and a former colleague sent me a message telling me the authority's transit board had called an emergency session and would I like to watch. I would. I found a public feed and I sat in my study with a cup of cold tea, and I watched the authority discover what Adara Celine had understood on a Tuesday 11 years before. The platform entered the primary corridor zone at 04:12, station time, on the 23rd day of the 8th month. It was moving at exactly the speed the Commons Charter required for a registered long-range survey transit, no faster, no slower. It was transmitting on every frequency the Commons Charter specified. Its identification beacon was functioning correctly. Its survey archive relay was transmitting continuously, as designed, into every open receiving channel in the corridor zone, because that was what it had been built to do: collect, compile, and transmit. The authority's Traffic Management Division flagged it at 0419 as an unregistered object, The compliance division ran its identifier against the revocation register and confirmed this was a human origin asset, reclassified as background interference, without standing in the corridor zone. A directive went out to the transit board within the hour. The transit board convened an emergency session at 0900. I watched the chair, a heavy-set man named Sorath Ven, who had been running the transit board for 12 years, open the session with a resolution to issue a compliance demand to the object. The object did not receive compliance demands. It received registered survey channel traffic only, because that was what its receivers were built for. This was in the original instrument. Sorath Ven issued the demand anyway. The object continued on its arc. What followed for the next 4 hours was, in its own way, the clearest demonstration I have ever seen of what happens when a regulatory body tries to apply its own framework to something that predates it. The transit board tried 6 procedural approaches to the problem. 2 required the object to be registered under the current framework. It was not, and the Commons Charter did not require it to be. 2 required the object to have acknowledged the revocation. It had not received notification, because the revocation had been filed under the revised framework, and the original instrument's notification clause required certified Commons channel delivery, which no one had sent. 1 required the object to be stationary for inspection. It was not stationary, and the Commons Charter's transit provisions explicitly prohibited forced stoppage of a registered long-range survey asset during active transit. The 6th approach was a simple hail on all frequencies. The object did not respond to hails. It transmitted survey data. At 1340, the transit board's own legal chamber delivered its opinion to the session floor. I watched Sorath Ven read the first page and set it face down on the table, which was when I understood that Adara Selen had not been the only one counting that day, 11 years before. Somewhere in the Earth Survey Liaison Office's archives, someone had been counting for a great deal longer than that. The legal chamber's opinion was 6 pages. The summary was 2 sentences. The pre-authority Commons Charter instrument governing the platform remained valid under the authority's own founding provisions. The revocation of survey standing, having been filed exclusively under the revised framework, had no jurisdiction over an asset registered under the original instrument. The platform was not background interference. It was a registered long-range survey asset on a lawful transit arc. It had been one for 71 years. At 1502, the platform exited the primary corridor zone on schedule and continued on its pre-plotted course toward the outer approach. It had been in the authority's corridor zone for 10 hours and 42 minutes. During that time it had transmitted, continuously and without interruption, 61 years of accumulated survey data into the authority's own open receiving channels, because the open receiving channels were Commons Charter infrastructure and the platform was a Commons Charter asset, and the two were designed to work together. 61 years of data on every stellar approach, every gravitational variance, every navigational hazard in a survey arc that crossed through the authority's primary zone, the secondary zone, and 6 separately licensed corridor segments the authority had absorbed from the old network. The authority's receiving systems had logged all of it, automatically, as required by the Commons Charter. When I turned off the public feed that evening, I sat for a while in the quiet of my study. I thought about Adara Selen. I thought about the first survey teams, the ones who had designed the original instrument and built the platform and launched it on a 70-year arc, and I wondered whether they had known, whether they had sat in a room somewhere and understood that a body like the authority would eventually exist and had built the instrument to outlast it. I think they probably had. I think that was the kind of people they were. The Transit Board's emergency session adjourned at 1611 without a resolution. The legal chamber's opinion entered the permanent record automatically, as opinions do. The revocation of survey standing was not rescinded. The Transit Board had no authority to rescind it, because it had been filed by the Compliance Division, not the Board. But the Compliance Division issued a quiet administrative notation 3 weeks later, clarifying that the revocation applied exclusively to revised framework assets. There were 12 pre-authority instruments still outstanding. Earth had never surrendered any of them. I finished my tea. It had been cold for some time, and it tasted of nothing much, and I thought that was probably the right way to feel about a thing that had simply happened as planned, on schedule, After 71 years in the dark between the stars,